So today we're going to practice solving by multiplying by the reciprocal. But before we can do that, we have to be able to identify the reciprocal of given problems. So the reciprocal is when you just basically flip your fraction. So the reciprocal of 2/5 is just 5 over 2. Notice I can use that fraction bar. That also means 5 over 2. So you can write a fraction using that one, or you can use the sideways fraction bar, right? So there's a lot of different ways to write a fraction. So to save space, I'm just going to write it that way. The reciprocal of -3/4 is still negative, but it's 4 over 3, right? So you flip the fraction, but it's still negative. The reciprocal of 1/5 is 5 divided by 1, and 5 divided by 1 is 5. So you really shouldn't write 5 over 1 because you should always simplify. So 1/5, its reciprocal is 5 over 1 when you flip it, but then you should always simplify. So the final answer that you should put, if they ask you what is the reciprocal of 1/5, you should say 5, right? The reciprocal of 1 is 1. It's its own reciprocal. So reciprocal of 1 is just 1. The reciprocal of -8/7 is still negative, but then the 7's on top and the 8's on the bottom, right? You're just flipping the fraction. And then the reciprocal of -1 is its own inverse. It's its own reciprocal. The reciprocal of -1/6 is still negative, but when you flip the 6 on top and the 1 on the bottom, 6 divided by 1, so that should just be -6. Right? So when you flip it, you get 6 over 1, and 6 divided by 1, any number divided by 1 is just itself. And then the reciprocal of 12/10 is 10 over 12. Right? You just put the numerator, goes into the numerator and denominator, just flip. And the reciprocal of 1/2 is 2, right? Because it was 2 over 1, which then equals 2. Now, what is the word opposite? Students often confuse the word reciprocal with the word opposite. So I wanted to do both of these to make sure you're not confusing those two concepts. The opposite is talking about being on the opposite side of the number line. So if I'm at -3 and I want you to stand and be on the opposite number of me, you have to be standing on +3. So you're the same distance from 0, but on the opposite side. So that's what the word opposite means. So it's the opposite side of the number line. So what's the opposite of -6 would have to be way over here at +6. The opposite of +8 would be -8. The opposite of +1/2 would be -1/2. The opposite of -2/3 would be +2/3, because you're just talking about the opposite side of the number line. That's different than reciprocal. Reciprocal is where you flip it, right? Number 5, what is the opposite of -6.34? It'd be +6.34. What is the opposite of 1? -1. Right? +1 and -1 are opposites. And when you add opposites, you always get 0. The opposite of -2 is +2. So that's the word opposite. So let's go back up and look at number 5 again. So let's take a moment and look at number 5 again. We want to find the reciprocal. So some kids will say 8 over 7 or 7 over 8. But we're not talking about the opposite. We're talking about the reciprocal. So it's going to stay negative, and then the 7 goes on top and the 8 goes on the bottom, right? That's what they mean by reciprocal. Just like on number 2, it's still negative, but then the 4 goes on top and the 3 goes on the bottom. So the difference between reciprocal and opposite. So now let's look at solving equations by using the reciprocal method. So remember, we could actually solve this equation by dividing both sides by 2/3, right? We could solve this by dividing by 1/4. We could solve this by dividing by -4/7. And we could solve this by dividing by -1/5. And you certainly could do that, but then that takes a lot of extra work. So it's just smarter that when you're multiplying a variable by a fractional coefficient, it's smarter to use the technique of multiplying by reciprocals. Because when you multiply reciprocals, you will always get 1. So let's just take a moment to think about that. If you have 2/3 and the reciprocal of that is 3/2, what happens when you multiply reciprocals? Right? You get a 6 over a 6, which is just 1. So it doesn't matter which reciprocals. If you take 4/5 and you multiply by its reciprocal, that's going to give you 20 divided by 20, which is 1. So when you multiply reciprocals, you always get 1. So that's a property. That's the multiplicative inverse property. So we're going to use the technique of multiplying by the reciprocal. So we're going to multiply by the reciprocal. So what's the reciprocal of 2/3? 3/2. So we're going to multiply